All right, members, we're on Amendment 1 to House Bill 3807. It's Representative Fry's amendment. He's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the body, when this bill hit the floor, I heard a lot of chatter about mandates, and it kind of threw up a signal about what we were doing, what this bill even dealt with. This amendment, what the bill seeks to do, I think, is a very admirable goal, which is to prevent and to limit skin cancer in South Carolina. We have certainly a high rate of that. This bill, I think, removes the mandate portion of it and makes the parents the gatekeeper of what we're trying to do. I think parents are informed about the decisions that they make. There were testimony about whether or not parents moving forward, they were unaware of how often their child under 18 was under.
All right, members are complaining they can't hear. House will be in order. Got a couple of bills coming up that are very important. This bill is very important. Mr. Fry's amendment is certainly important and enlightening. You won't be enlightened unless you can hear. So House will be in order. Mr. Fry is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. This puts it back on the parents, and I think there are several states throughout the country that do that each time that a child under 18 decides to use a tanning bed, that they must have parental consent in person by the parent. If we go this route with this amendment, we look at other states like Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho. So I think there's a lot of states that do it this way. It puts the gatekeeper as the parent. It informs the parents on how often their child is using a tanning bed or doing whatever else. And I think at the end of the day, what this body and what this state says by doing this is that we are letting parents make choices for their children based on information, that we give them that information, that they make informed choices, and that we're not mandating that children don't do this. If we don't adopt this amendment, we join states like California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii and Illinois and Massachusetts in banning something that I think, but at the end of the day, I think this comes down to a fundamental question of whether or not we mandate something or we give informed decisions. We let parents make choices for their children. I'll take any questions.
All right, Mr. Hill is recognized for question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Fry. I just want to make sure I understand correctly what's going on here. If we don't pass this amendment, will a 16-year-old be allowed, will a parent be allowed to consent to a 16-year-old to go and use the services of a tanning facility?
No, it is a blanket ban. If this amendment does not pass, it is blanket ban under 18.
So the underlying bill takes away both the ability of the 16-year-old and the ability of the parent to consent to that.
Correct.
So you're taking away choice. And does your amendment, Mr. Fry, did I hear correctly that your amendment restores that choice?
I think so, and I think one of the things that parents will say and that I've heard have testified to is that they consented under our current law to allow their child to use a tanning facility for whatever reason, psoriasis, some skin condition, prom, who knows, but they were unaware of how often they used it and they went. So this just basically says that a parent moving forward, if you're consenting to this activity, that you must show up, that you must be there with your minor child, and that way a parent is aware of how often their child is or isn't using a tanning facility. And I think there are some conditions that vitamin D deficiencies. I mean, I'm not saying that tanning beds are a medical phenomenon here, but there are parental decisions on why people use it, and I think that is best left between a family and their child, as opposed to a state telling a business, you must be the gatekeeper of this under 18. And I think that this kind of restores a balance a little bit, and really, quite frankly, Mr. Hill, gets to the question, achieves the goal of limiting access to tanning beds for minors under 18, but makes the gatekeeper the parent as opposed to the state or the business.
Thank you, Mr. Fry. Did you know that when we heard this bill in the 3M committee that it was pointed out that current law allows a minor to use tanning facilities with parental consent, and DHEC regulations currently require that consent form to be witnessed by the tanning facility operator. Did you know that, Mr. Fry?
I did know that, and I think what has happened on that is much like parents complain of, that they have consented to maybe some degree of limited use for their minor, but they're unaware that their child is going every day or whatever. So I think this kind of strikes that balance of achieving the goals, which I think are very admirable, about limiting skin cancer, but it puts that decision back on the parents and making sure that they are informed about how often these services are being used by their child.
Right. And Mr. Fry, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you're saying that, there aren't risks involved, that there isn't a decision that needs to be made. You're just wanting to make sure that the people who have the authority to have a role in their kid's life and help make those decisions and medical decisions about risks that are being taken, that it stays with the parents.
Exactly. I mean, there are certainly, I'm not going to stand up here and say that tanning beds are actually beneficial and that they don't cause any problems. They do, just like sun exposure and just like any number of things has detrimental effects. But I think that decision rests better with the parents as opposed to the business or the state.
And I agree with you, Mr. Fry, and I thank you for seeking to protect informed consent rather than making a blanket state policy on something.
Thank you, Mr. Hill.
Mr. Garry Smith is recognized for question.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry, thank you for putting this amendment up. Mr. Fry, did you know that there's a reason that some people go to tanning beds other than just to get a tan?
Yeah, I think that's been documented when you read about maybe beneficial uses of it, and I'm not going to subscribe to the science behind it, but there are reasons why people use it other than getting a great tan like you have, sir.
Thank you for recognizing that, Mr. Fry. Thank you very much. And I wanted to point out, one of the things that people use that is for light treatment. Did you know that?
What was that? I didn't hear that.
One thing that people use it for is for light treatment. Did you know that?
I did. Yes, sir.
For people who have psoriasis and things like that, skin sorts of disorders, you know that people under 18 have those same disorders?
They do, and I think that's what this goes. I think decisions and information is important, and the internet is a wonderful thing, and where we are in society is a wonderful thing, that you can get all this information and you can make those decisions for you and your family. We don't put that onus back on the business, right? It's not going to stop somebody who wants to excessively tan from tanning because they're going to go to a disreputable business or they're going to buy a tanning bed for their own house. So I think this is an overreach a little bit from a government perspective, and that we really need to kind of restore the balance. The goals are admirable, but informed decisions on parents are where we need to go with this, and not put that on the business who has set up their shop in this state, in whatever community they decide to go to, that we have allowed them to operate a certain way for a long time, and now we're seeking to say, business, not only must you do X, Y, and Z, but if anyone under 18 comes in here, you're the gatekeeper and you're responsible. I think that goes back to what the parents are supposed to do and not us as a state.
Did you know it's much cheaper to go to a tanning bed to do this than to have to go to a dermatologist's office?
I was not aware of that, but thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah. Thank you for putting this amendment up there. As a father or a son who has psoriasis and who has to get those light treatments, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mr. Odd is recognized for question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Fry. I really am intrigued by this conversation. I appreciate you taking the podium and offering the amendment. And I think you've done, a wonderful job of trying to make a not so great amendment sound pretty good, and you've done a good job about that. Did you know?
Well, Mr. Ott, this is why we call you Russell number 1 and me Russell number 2. I'm just trying to learn from you, sir.
And I have deferred that title to you every single time. Did you know? But help me understand now. We have throughout this legislation, we have clearly shown that there are extremely negative impacts from UV rays and tanning, especially at a young age. Children younger than 18. We've established that, correct?
Yeah, I think that's established. Just like going to the sun or laying out by the lake or the beach is also harmful. Yes, sir.
Sure, but there are differences, correct? That's what I've learned. That's what I've talked to a lot of the advocates for this legislation, that the UV rays that are right on top of you in the tanning bed is is actually a lot worse for you than actually going into the natural sun. Would that be a fair statement?
Well, I think both are harmful for sure, but I would assume that the whole purpose of a tanning bed, obviously, is that you accelerate that tan, right?
That's exactly right, which is why the title of the bill is called the Teen Skin Cancer Prevention Act, correct?
I didn't name the bill, Mr. Ott.
But it's there. I mean, that's clearly what we're trying to accomplish with this legislation. So now I just want to make sure.
Mr. Ott, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Mr. Fry, your time on the amendment is expired. Mr. Fry is recognized for a second 10 minutes. Mr. Ott, you had a question.
Thank you for that, Mr. Fry. But what we're doing is we're trying to carve out some exceptions to that. And I understand, look, I'm all for parental involvement, did you know? And I think that is what we're doing here is we're trying to air or acknowledge parental involvement or parental decisions in this process, correct?
I think so. But I think that the question is, what have other states done in this realm, right? They've either done nothing. We have at least some modicum of regulations on this, that there's some degree of consent by a parent. But you look at states that have gone to a blanket ban like this bill originally sought to do, and those states like Massachusetts and California, and they have gone to that banning system. But there are a lot of states that have said under 18, I mentioned some of them earlier, under 18 is okay as long as the parent is there in person. And I think this gets to the heart of dealing with the issue without putting that onus back on the business.
Well, then why don't we give parents the ability to do that for things like tobacco?
I think you're comparing apples to oranges here. At the end of the day, there are some medical uses, as Mr. Smith talked about earlier, that people use it for. Members in this body, when I was looking at doing this amendment, approached me and said, my son or my daughter used it from a very limited perspective for a very limited amount of time. So I think this amendment gets to the goal of limiting exposure for minors in a tanning bed, but it is not an overreach and a blanket ban like states like California have done.
And I don't think it's apples to oranges, to be honest with you. I mean, we have clearly, as a state, made a policy decision that we think tobacco use amongst teenagers smoking, smokeless tobacco is not a good thing. I'm in the middle of trying to quit it right now. It's awful. Okay, I'm 4 days in and I'm not the nicest person to be around right now because I'm trying to break that habit. And did you know that I think tanning, if you talk with a lot of people, it can almost be an addictive type of activity and behavior as well. And that is why the authors of the bill and why I'm supportive of let's try to stop that at an early age, Mr. Fry.
You're right. And I think what you just suggested is what this amendment does, is that there are addictive qualities. People do overdo it, but parents are largely unaware how often their child is using a tanning facility. And I think this gets to the issue of what you're talking about without making the gatekeeper, like I've said before, the state or the business.
And I appreciate it. And, I certainly think that this is better than what we currently have, which is an open door policy. But I hate to see, Mr. Fry, when we've got good bills like this, where we back up, when we know that we could actually do a lot more good by just going ahead and biting that bullet, understanding that it might not be the most popular thing to do in everyone's view, but let's do what we know what is best for the kids under 18. But I appreciate your explanation. Thank you.
Mr. Ott, thank you. And just in brief reply, I'm very sympathetic, I think, to businesses that operate in this state. And I think that when we go that route and that we start banning things and we start legislating things up here, what we're focused on are the minor children and the families themselves, but what we are forgetting is that business owner who has put a lot of sweat equity, a lot of capital into their business, and all of a sudden we're telling them that the whole entire system that they have set up for themselves and their own family is no longer applicable in this state, and that they are now tasked with being the gatekeeper for that. So I think this restores that balance, Mr. Ott.
Mr. Hart? Ms. Norrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had something else to ask you, and then you started talking about the business model, and so that I found that intriguing. So are you saying that is the reason for this amendment to protect businesses whose model is to sell tanning to children under 18?
No, Ms. Norrell, and fortunately for us, we've
I'm
been
glad I
looking
could get
for an
a chance to
opportunity to
clarify.
oppose each other on an issue. But I think I'm very sympathetic, certainly, to businesses in the state and what we legislate up here. And but I think the fundamental question of what this amendment seeks to do is: do we put that on the business itself, or do we put that on the parents to make informed decisions for their child? And I think that is the fundamental question that this body hopefully will answer today.
Okay. Well, did you know that there are a lot of parents, especially moms, and I've seen a lot of them who have they love tanning. They love to get very, very brown. And I'm looking at your amendment, and it looks like there's no minimum age. So a mom who loves to get very, very brown could take her 9-year-old to the tanning facility with her and sign a permission slip and let that 9-year-old go in and tan? Would
No,
that
I
be
think that
permitted
they're
under
under
your
18.
amendment?
I think that I think that this goes to, if I'm not mistaken, staff, I think we've got a ban under 14. Is that right?
I think there's no minimum age, Mr. Fry.
Well, that there might not be the case, and if that is the case, then we can certainly seek to change that with unanimous consent.
I think that would.
But I think that the end of the day, I think that certainly people make bad decisions regarding their tanning habits, but the information is out there for people to make that choice.
I think Mr. Smith pointed out that tanning is cheaper than going to a dermatologist. But wouldn't you agree that going outside is cheaper than going to a tanning bed?
Well, I certainly agree with that. I mean, the sunshine is free for now anyway, right?
For now.
For now.
And also that the sun is less dangerous than a tanning bed. I heard you discuss that with Mr. Ott. Would you agree with that?
Well,
Would you need more information?
Well, I would need more information, but I will tell you this, Ms. Norrell. My assumption would be that using traditional methods of going outside are probably far more beneficial than a tanning bed. So but I don't think that that's what we're getting to here. Whether or not we're weighing inside versus outside, I think it's whether or not we put that on the business or we put that on the family.
Well, I think to an extent we are, but I think that, so you would agree because the sun provides vitamin D and the tanning bed does not. But the tanning bed also, did you know, creates only UVA rays, which penetrate more deeply than the sun's rays and are at a greater cause of melanoma than the sun itself. Were you aware of that?
I'll take your word for it.
Thank you. And isn't it true also that tanning is not a medically recognized treatment for any type of skin condition?
I'll take your word for that too. But again, I think that there are uses that people have subscribed to that have benefited acne, psoriasis, as we talked about. Is it the only way? Certainly not. But I think those decisions are best left within a family.
Thank you.
Mr. Robert Williams is recognized for a question. Mr. Williams, you got about 2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm trying not to use that 2.5 minutes, but Mr. Fry, thank you so much. Do you think Horry County is the capital of tanning in the state?
I don't know that answer. I think there's a lot of folks, certainly maybe in the Rock Hill area, there's probably a good healthy dose of those facilities up there, all the kids from Charlotte coming on down.
But I'm pretty sure you guys got a great ray of the sun down there off the coast. Is that correct?
Sun and sand, yes, sir.
Yeah. Going back to the amendment here, let me ask you a couple of questions here. Will this help the medical community by what you're doing here to kind of keep this as it relates to cancer?
Will it help the medical community? I'm not aware if it will help or hurt the medical community. Either way, I think this is certainly an amendment dealing with businesses. What a medical provider decides to do with their patient is certainly their decision. And I have heard of limited circumstances where a doctor has said that a tanning facility might clear something up or whatever. But I don't know that it helps or hurts a medical provider.
But we are putting the responsibility back on the parents and as well as the business. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Simmons is recognized for a question. Ms. Simmons passes. Mr. Rose.
Hello, Mr. Fry. Did you know I have a lot of respect for you?
Well, I appreciate that, sir.
Thank you. You heard testimony or there was testimony at subcommittee that one-time use of a tanning bed could subject somebody to 60% chance, more likelihood of getting skin cancer.
And I'm not here to dispute the validity of that. This is not what this does, Mr. Rose. This is making choices back to the family, and people can do their own due diligence and their own research to determine if that is a healthy thing for them to do.
I understand, Mr. Fry, but to borrow a page out of Mr. Tommy Pope's book, the question is, you heard testimony at subcommittee that someone getting a tanning bed, going to a tanning bed for one-time use would subject that person to a 60% more likelihood of skin cancer, correct?
I'm not on that particular committee, so I'll take your word for it that happened.
Mr. Fry, your time on the amendment is expired. Dr. Ridgway is recognized on the amendment. Dr. Ridgway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be brief. Really not brief, but anyhow, I was going to ask questions, but I was not high on the list. I got to bubble late. But anyhow, my question about this parental consent is, does the parent have to sign the consent form in front of the people at the tanning bed salon, or is it something sent from home? And if it is, how do you know that's the parent's signature? It could be my friend's signature. If the parent has to be present, how do you know that's the parent? Do you have to bring the birth certificate with them? So I'm a little concerned about that. Mr. Ott raised the point about tobacco. Alcohol is the same way. We don't allow 18-year-olds to buy alcohol or tobacco because we know of the physical harm it causes them. Speaking of physical harm, that's already been mentioned, and it was brought up by Mr. Fry, this question: what have other states done? Well, right now we're representing South Carolina, and we have to defend South Carolina. And in South Carolina, there are in South Carolina, 1,223 people are diagnosed with melanoma every year, and 146 of those die.
Would you check and see if anybody's taking
melanoma is the 5th most common cancer diagnosed in South Carolina, and melanoma deaths rate 18th in the state. In the U.S., South Carolina rates high. We finally rate high in something. We rate 9th in the incidence of melanoma deaths. So I'm for South Carolina. I think we ought to consider what happens in this state. The Food and Drug Administration has an approved medical device for phototherapy for medical treatment of skin conditions. It treats the specific area with specific doses, not the entire body. Let's talk about the people who don't like this. How about the American Cancer Society, the American Society for Clinical Oncology, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Association for Cancer Research all say there's no medical indication for the use of tanning devices in the diagnosis or treatment of a disease. The World Health Organization says that the indoor tanning devices are confined to the highest level of cancer risk. They're group 1 level, which means that it is carcinogenic or will cause cancer to humans. If we're going to use this for a medical reason, why do we have to have parental consent? Why don't we just have the doctor write a prescription for tanning bed use? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ridgway. Mr. Finley is recognized. Mr. Finley.
Mr. Speaker,
You're going to ask a question before he speaks, Mr. Pope.
Yes, sir. Question.
Mr. Pope is recognized for a question.
Mr. Finley, are you aware that homeschoolers are often interested in tanning beds and other issues also?
No, sir, I was not.
Well, I'd like to inform you that homeschoolers are very interested in these things. As a matter of fact, some folks from back home, Gracie Duncan, Ariana Duncan, and Deborah Tutherow are here representing schools of choice, and they're very interested in what you have to hear, and I'd ask if the House could welcome them.
Thank you, sir. Glad they're here.
Stand and let us welcome you to the South Carolina House. We're delighted to have you. Big wave. Mr. Finley.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I'll be very brief. How many of y'all have watched someone die from skin cancer? Right here. My dad. What I will tell you is, if you have ever watched it, you do not want anything that allows children to exacerbate their chance of getting this. There's no win. This, I understand the idea of choice. I understand that. And generally, I am very for it. But I am not going to be in favor of letting parents sign a slip of paper that lets their children get hit in the head with an axe. Skin cancer, at the time that my dad contracted it, was in essence a death sentence. 2/3 of the people who got it died. And they died horrible, agonizing deaths. Why we would allow children under 18 to do this is beyond me. I don't think, perhaps I am too close to this issue, and I understand that. But I will tell you that what you lose when it happens to you is beyond anything you can imagine or ever want to see. Mr. Speaker, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Ridgway has a question. He's recognized.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Finley.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Finley, is it true that we require children of a certain age to be strapped into seatbelt devices and car seat devices to protect them from potential injury?
Yes, sir.
Can we, Mr. Finley, allow children to ride outside of those devices with parental consent?
In fact, it's exactly the opposite. If someone is stopped with a child who should be restrained in the car not restrained, they get a ticket.
This state, Mr. Finley, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, has decided that riding unrestrained in a seatbelt is dangerous to your health. But not everybody who rides in the seatbelt gets in an accident and gets hurt. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct, Dr. Ridgway. And I think the point that you're trying to make is that you don't always get it, but when you do, sometimes it is so horrific that you can't explain it. What you're saying is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And what I would tell you on this is that an ounce of prevention, do not let young children expose themselves to something that is a glorification of a culture that is already entirely too focused on beauty at most points, that exposes them to this potential risk long term, makes very little sense to me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Rose had a question. I'm sorry, Mr. Rose, you're recognized.
Mr. Finley, are
Yes,
you
sir.
aware that at subcommittee there was testimony from medical professionals that said one-time use of a tanning bed could increase one's chances of getting skin cancer by 60%?
I was not until you brought that to my attention.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that someone, a child, should be an adult to be able to knowingly accept that risk.
What I am saying is that from my personal perspective, no one would ever knowingly take that risk, because if they see what the cost is, it would never outweigh the benefit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hill is recognized to speak on the amendment. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was on I attended the committee where this bill was heard in subcommittee. We heard all the public testimony and actually got quite an education. Now, I'm not up here to put myself out as any sort of a medical professional, which I'm not. But I do want to call to attention facts that have been brought out in subcommittee and facts which have been glossed over here today during this debate. There was a mention made of a 60% risk. And you can actually see that in the bill on page 1, line 32. However, upon questioning of a dermatologist that spoke in subcommittee, it became clear that there are many different variants of skin cancer. There is melanoma, there's metastatic basal cell, there's squamous cell, and then there's the difference between metastatic versus localized. In other words, not all skin cancer, as you well know, is dangerous. It can be surgically removed. It's no big deal. A percentage of occasions are dangerous. And clearly, we want to inform parents and kids of the risks of those dangers. But to say that there is a 60% chance that you're going to die of cancer from one visit at a tanning bed would be to overstate the case. Now, I don't know if that's what my colleague meant to say or not. I'm not sure if that's what this bill means to say when it brings up the 59% of risk of melanoma. Squamous cell carcinoma by 67%, basal cell carcinoma by 29%. But I think we need to be clear and careful with our facts. It was also claimed by another colleague that tanning is not a medically recognized treatment, and yet the dermatologist that spoke in subcommittee made it clear that there is a form of tanning treatment which she is able to use and prescribe. The only difference is the type of bulb that's involved and perhaps the duration, the wavelength that's involved. I would also point out that there have been comparisons here between going out in the sun and using a tanning bed. There are some differences in wavelengths. There are some differences in intensity. And yes, some of those differences do pose risks. And yes, parents and kids should be aware of those risks before they consent. I also want to go back to what was said a few minutes ago, likening this bill to car seat and seatbelt laws. Well, if you wanted to prevent the risk of someone being involved in a crash, by the way, some people that are involved in a crash wearing a car seat or wearing a seatbelt, rather, can't get free of that, and tragedy still happens. So let's not pretend that that's a foolproof way to prevent death in the event of an accident. The only foolproof way to prevent death in the event of an accident is to never get in the car in the first place. So if you want to make a good analogy, the good analogy here would be that this bill is like saying that kids can't get in the car until they're 18. The parental consent, the informed consent provisions in this bill and in current DHEC regulations are like the seatbelt laws, all right? You can put your kid in the car, but you got to put a seatbelt on them. That'll help prevent most tragedies. Nobody's here suggesting that we shouldn't do that. Nobody here is suggesting that we shouldn't have informed consent. Nobody here is suggesting that kids should be able to go and circumvent parental involvement and consent in their decisions. I am against the amendment. I'm for the amendment. I'm against the concept that we take away parental consent.
Let me know when you take questions, Mr. Hill.
I will take questions in one moment, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, sir.
I want to also point out I have a copy of DHEC Regulation 61-106, which is currently in effect. As you may recall, inspection of tanning facilities was stopped for a while, but this body passed legislation to put that back into effect. And so current DHEC regulations say that, yes, they are inspected. Part of those provisions requires the operator to inform the consumer, and I quote, of the dangers of ultraviolet radiation exposure, including photoallergic reactions and photosensitizing reactions, determining customer use of potentially photosensitizing agents, assuring that the customer reads and properly signs all forms required by these regulations, reviewing, signing, and ensuring required documentation is completed for minors or illiterate or visually impaired consumers, maintaining records, recognizing and reporting consumer actual or alleged ultraviolet radiation injuries to the registrant, using protective eyewear, and setting timers which control the duration. There are further controls, and Mr. Speaker, could we get a little order? I think it's important that we hear this.
House will be in order. Let's give Mr. Hill your attention. House will come to order. Mr. Hill.
If a tanning facility operator violates these, a first offense is $500. If they use medical lamps or non-compliant lamps or filters, first offense is $1,000. It goes all the way up to $3,000 for a third offense. Unsanitary conditions or failure to provide and ensure use of FDA-approved equipment and eyewear, $500 for first offense. And it goes on and on. Failure to operate a facility in a manner so as not to cause a potential overexposure to non-ionizing radiation, first offense, $500. That includes potential transmission of a communicable disease or injury. There are provisions in this reg about burning. There are provisions in this reg about operator training, warning signs, sanitation, bulb replacement, and so on and so on. That's why we have licensing, and that's why we have inspections of these places. I also want to point out that there are federal regulations involved here as well. The devices themselves are now classified. The FDA reclassified them in 2014 as a Class 2 device, which means they tightened their safety controls on these devices. The FDA has been communicating about the risks. The U.S. Surgeon General has been communicating about the risks. This has been likened to tobacco. We don't let kids. I was sent this flyer, which is a little sexist if you ask me. It says we don't let her smoke. We shouldn't let her tan. Why should we assume that it's a her? But at any rate, we're not talking about smoking. We're not talking about lung cancer. We're talking about tanning. It's a different process. There are different risks. And we're allowed to make distinctions. We're allowed to look at, we're allowed to weigh different types of risks that have varying degrees. So what this comes back down to me, is what is consistent with the right of the individual and with the right of the parent. And do we as a state know better? And to put this in context, there are some other things that kids under the age of 18 are allowed to do. I'm told they're allowed to get a tattoo with parental consent. I'm told that they're allowed to go into the military and serve prior to the age of 18 with parental consent. I'm even told that the age of consent for sex is the age of 16. And you don't have to have parental consent for that. And guess what? There's some pretty big risks of cancer involved with that too. And yet we're not banning that.
Time on the amendment expired. Mr. Hill?
I'd like it.
Mr. Hill is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'll conclude my remarks and take any questions.
Mr. Garry Smith had the first question, I believe, and he's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Hill, for taking my question. Mr. Hill, when you look at this and you look at the problem that they're trying to solve here, did you know that UV rays and radiation from the sun is the #1 cause of melanoma and skin cancer?
Yes, Mr. Smith, and I find it a little curious that the folks defending this bill seem to be acting as if the sun is much less dangerous. You almost get the impression that everyone's fine with kids going out into the sun. We're not attempting to regulate that for its risks.
Exactly.
And so, but I'm like you. I distinctly remember the Cancer Society putting out lots of information about why you shouldn't go out in the sun and tan.
And if we're going to send Big Brother out there after us over getting into a tanning bed where you can actually control how much exposure you have, then why don't we just go out there and say, all right, kids, if you're under 18, you can only spend, 15 minutes outside? 30 minutes outside? I mean, where do we take and stop this?
Well, I agree, Mr. Smith, and, you know, medical studies show that life on this earth is hazardous to one's health. And so for us to try to take away every single choice that could possibly lead to an adverse outcome, such as cancer, would be ultimately to take away every possible choice that a person could make. And you would have, life would not be worth living because you wouldn't even be able to live at all.
Exactly. If we're going to take and if we're really concerned about kids, we're really concerned about their exposure and stuff, why don't we go with the #1 issue, which is exposure to sun?
Right.
And the UV rays from radiation from sun. So if we really want to take and have Big Brother come out there and go after parents and kids, then why aren't we limiting their time outside?
Well,
is that something that parents shouldn't do to begin with?
Mr. Smith, I think that a good faith effort to address teen skin cancer risks would have to include that. If you were being honest and consistent, you would have to address that, and yet this bill makes no attempt to do so. Perhaps it's because the authors of the bill know that that's a non-starter, that that's ridiculous. But that's the argument I think that you and I are trying to make here, is that taking away a choice which for most people is not going to prove to be fatal by any means. The most of the risks are annoyances at best, that you can't make that decision at all.
Well, you know, one of the things that we oftentimes do in here, which, you know, bothers me a great deal, is we often try to prevent people from being stupid. Did you know that?
Yes, Mr. Smith, I agree.
And, you know, we can't write enough laws to keep people from doing stupid things. From people staying out there in the sun too long, from people staying in a tanning bed for too long. But we try anyway. But, you know, at some point you've got to say enough is enough, that this really isn't what we need to be doing as a government, that this really isn't what is a responsibility of the government, particularly in the state of South Carolina. What is a priority? What is it that we're supposed to take and do?
Well, Mr. Smith, I just don't think that this bill passes the straight face test. Now, I think that the amendment is an improvement. I think the amendment at least restores some parental choice. But at the end of the day, I mean, there's only so much. And understand, the only tool that the state has as its disposal, or let me rephrase that, the primary tool that the state has at its disposal is the use of force. And that force comes in many forms, but it's the use of force. And every time we force something, it's at the trade-off of liberty. And so, Mr. Smith, I think that, we definitely have a role to protect life and to protect liberty. And in order to have a maximal amount of liberty and a maximal chance at living, we have to have the right amount of government. And so nobody's up here proposing that we not have any government and let everybody and everybody just do whatever they want. What we're saying is that before you go and do this, the parents got to be there. And parental consent has to be given. And they have to be informed of the risks. And they have to take into account any potential factors that may lead to an adverse outcome.
Are you familiar with Dr. Os Guinness in the Golden Triangle of Freedom, that concept?
I'm familiar with the name. You might have to help me out on what you're referring to specifically.
The name Guinness, to begin with, is a very much a well-known name. He is actually one of the great-great-great-grandsons of Arthur Guinness, who actually is Guinness beer. But Dr. Os Guinness now, he has moved from Ireland to the United States, and he has this concept. It's based upon our founding fathers and their whole idea of liberty and how our representative republic would work and how it's best to work with people who have value and who are able to take and control themselves. Did you know that?
I did not know that, but I'm glad that he's calling attention to it.
Yes, and one of the things that he says is that when you don't have those values, you don't have that faith, which is all tied directly in the triangle to freedom, then what happens? We know that what happens when people can't control themselves and can't take responsibility for themselves, what happens? We create laws and regulations. Did you know that?
We do, yeah. So I would argue that we create far too many.
And I was just making a joke earlier when I talked about we can't write enough laws to keep people from doing stupid, but that's exactly what Os Guinness is talking about, is that every time we create another law or regulation to try and keep people from doing things that they shouldn't be doing because they can't control themselves, what do we lose?
We lose our liberty.
We lose our liberty and freedom. And at some point in time, we've got to stand up as a representative republic and as a body, a General Assembly, and say, this enough is enough. We just can't continue to take and go down this path of trying to take and regulate people who just don't have the ability to regulate themselves.
Right. I'm in agreement with you, Mr. Smith.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Rose has a question. He's recognized. Mr. Rose? Not. Mr. Finley, since you're gonna step away, all right. Mr. Ridge, Mr. Finley is recognized on the amendment.
Look, Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I always enjoy a bit of farce in the middle of the day. We have now enjoyed that. Let's be very clear about what we just said. Mr. Hill very clearly admitted that tanning is regulated. So, what we are doing is debating regulating tanning. Let me quote a South Carolina dermatologist. That tanning is a known carcinogen on par with tobacco and asbestos. Let me say that again. Tanning beds, asbestos, and tobacco. We regulate this industry today. So let's regulate it, and let's regulate it thoughtfully. What I am saying is we do not let 18-year-olds smoke cigarettes legally. Why should we let them tan? We do not let anyone in an area with asbestos. Why would we do this? But more importantly, let's step back and let's ask ourselves, what do the experts in this field think? The South Carolina Dermatological Association is against this amendment. They do this for a living. They are the people who understand significantly more than we ever will about skin cancer and its impacts. They say vote this amendment down. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, we occasionally wrap ourselves around axles. Mr. Hart nods. But the idea that we are conflating the use of tanning beds with minor children and life and liberty is one bridge too far. Enough. Enough. We do not let our children smoke cigarettes because they're bad for you. We do not let anyone work in an environment with asbestos because it is bad for you. We should not let an 18-year-old tan because it is bad for you. And I am not quoting Kirkman Finley, who has a personal experience. I am quoting studies from the Cleveland Clinic. I am quoting from doctors in South Carolina who do this for a living. So we can ask ourselves, do we want to be intellectually pure and damaging to minors, or do we want to do something helpful that the doctors say prevents problems and issues in the future? I would argue that that is where I will come down. If that makes me intellectually and ideologically unpure, so be it. I will live with that happily. But what I can tell you is it is easy to say that this is a risk until it hits you. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I think, is there an amendment now, Dr.
Mr. Finley, Ms. Bernstein has a question, and Mr. Hart after
Yes,
her
sir.
has a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much, Representative Finley, because as you know, well, I'm not sure, do you know that I agree with you wholeheartedly, and you and I tend to get on legislation together that helps to benefit the well-being of children, because sometimes they're not as developed to make these decisions. And not only are dermatologists, did you know, are against this amendment, but pediatricians as well. My pediatrician, who I refer to lots of times and who was integral in our vaping bill because of the incidence of children using vaping products, has stated that the incidence of melanoma and cancers with children under the age of 18, so we're really talking about under the age of 18, she sees it on a daily basis. So I echo everything you're saying, and thank you. I think sometimes less is more, so I'm going to end it at that point. But I did want to thank you for those comments and would encourage the body to agree.
Mr. Hart's recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Finley, I agree with you that enough is enough. Did you know that there is a significant number of members in this body who've never been to a tanning bed?
You and me both, sir.
Did you also know that no matter how long we debate this bill, there's a significant number of members in this body that would never go to a tanning bed?
Mr. Hart, I can only speak for myself. I never intend to attend a
Did you also know that there's also a significant portion of members in this body who would never send their kids to a tanning bed?
I would certainly hope so.
You would never believe this. I've never been to a tanning bed, ever. Can we please vote on this bill?
I think as soon as we are ready, I think, Mr. Hart, did you know that I think there's going to be an amendment? Thank you.
Question is adoption of amendment number 1. Mr. Finley moves to table amendment number 1. Mr. Fry requests a roll call. The 9 members second. 9 members do. Question is table amendment number 1. Roll call is required. Vote on the board's order. If all members wishing to vote voted. If all members wishing to vote voted. Any objection to closing roll call? Mr. Johnson, are you running towards your desk? Right there. Any objection to closing roll call? Hearing none, clerk close the polls and tabulate. Vote of 5945, amendment number 1 is tabled.